the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you are answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. At the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I know if you have to leave sharply, we have to vacate at 6, but I can stay for a little bit. I love talking about this. I've been working with cities for quite a little bit, the last, let's say, 8 years. And there's increasingly an interest in cities. So many organizations are now trying to figure out why cities work, what makes some cities thrive and others really struggle. How do the cities can be improved? What do they bring? How do things relate? And so just some facts about cities. It's estimated that cities are responsible for 3/4 of the world's gross domestic product. And so that's where billions of people live. Right now, almost 54% of the world population lives in urban areas. This varies by region, but this is a little bit of a progression of how this has developed, and the expectations to 2050 is that 75% of the population will live in urban areas. I do think that at some point we're going to hit some, a stabilization point, but these are the estimates right now. So with that in mind, there's lots of people that are thinking cities are experiencing really big challenges. And part of it is the globalization. So before, things that happen in one city maybe affected the region a little bit, but stayed contained. And right now, things that happen in one city really can have global and systemic effects. This is just, I thought, a really fun fact that 60% of the Christmas decorations come from this city in China. So I thought that was interesting. But more recently, I have been working with a very big project that the Rockefeller Foundation has, leading the recovery and the rebuild in Puerto Rico. And so something that I also find there is that after the hurricanes, there was a global, basically, a scarcity of those plastic bags that are used to put in medical equipment, because apparently they're mostly produced in Puerto Rico. So something that happened in a small island that is not even really that well connected affected really the rest of the world. It's all public health emergencies. The last one and the most recent one being the Zika pandemic that traveled so fast and affected so many nations. Second one is climate change. Fires. This is an example from Australia. We work in 100 cities. That's why it's 100 resilient cities. But also here in California, and flooding, and not to say the recent hurricanes in the past hurricane season that destroyed almost the whole Caribbean and affected Florida and Houston. So these events seem to become more frequent and more powerful and more unpredictable. And also, a big challenge is the urbanization rate. So how rapidly these cities are growing, and how the pace at which cities respond with their infrastructure and public policy is much slower than the pace of population growth. And that poses a lot of stresses on the city, including aging infrastructure, congestion, extremely high transportation costs sometimes, So part of the thing. So with all this in mind, I'm going to talk briefly about shocks and stresses, because that's basically the foundation of the resilience concept. Then, what is resilience? How do we identify it? How do we attempt to measure it? And I know this is a very technical class, and most of you are from an engineering or technical background. So bear in mind, it is an attempt to try to determine what things are more resilient than others, more than putting a number in terms of how much resilient something or a city is. And then also what we see the future and the opportunities for urban resilience, where we hope young professionals like you can contribute, and also what exactly do we work in 100 resilient cities, a brief overview of what the work is that we do with the cities, and then we'll open for questions and answers. But if you have something that you're dying to say during the presentation, I'm also happy to answer it. So shocks and stresses are the basis of basically the concept of resilience. Resilience means be prepared not only for risk that you can measure and study, probabilistic risk, that's mostly what disaster risk management is focused on, but also unexpected circumstances, and also take into account chronic stresses. So acute shocks, things that happen once, and stresses, things that are affecting the city in an ongoing basis. So flooding is an example of a shock. It rains heavily, the city floods. It's a huge problem. But the other one is, for example, this photo, second photo on the right. It's Pittsburgh. It really is an example of a city that slowly became less competitive and was starting to be abandoned. And so you started seeing things like these. And that's also something that really affects the cities. And the idea is that shocks are important and can have very bad effects on the functioning of the city, but so are stresses. And the accumulation of stresses, thank you, this is my cheat sheet. And the accumulation of stresses can be, can aggravate to shocks. For example, in Puerto Rico now, the problems that Puerto Rico is facing are really, yes, it was a Hurricane 5 storm, it destroyed the city, but it's almost as much the destruction caused by the hurricane as the underlying conditions that were there before. The lack of political, solid political system, a population that was leaving the island already, 10 years of economic crisis, lack of social cohesion. So it's the hurricane, but also it's a lot what the hurricane uncovered in Puerto Rico. So some examples of shocks and stresses: earthquakes, wildfires, flooding, civil unrest, terrorism. Those are shocks. And then stresses, slow processes that affect the city in an ongoing or day-to-day basis: homelessness, lack of social cohesion, poverty, aging infrastructure, crime. And this crime is something that we see in a lot of the Latin American cities, which is my region, where I've worked most, but it's also an issue here. So shocks and stresses also can bring opportunities for cities, to evolve and in some circumstances transform themselves. So I think it was the mayor of Chicago that says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Yes, it's a crisis, but it also presents opportunities to rethink how the cities are working, like the Puerto Rico Sancerre right now, and there's lots of reference to that work because that's what I'm doing on the day-to-day right now, but it's like build back better. Just don't build back what you have, but really think about what you can do and do things differently. So the idea is that a shock or a stress will cause inevitably problems in the growth path of a city, but a resilient city will be able to not only survive, but also adapt and grow as a result. So I'm going to talk about what is urban resilience for the Rockefeller Foundation. And I really want to be clear, urban resilience is a term that has been used by many, many, many fields. It starts around the biology field, but then it really quickly passed to psychology. There's a lot of studies about resilience post-Holocaust, and then it was picked up by business administration. I think engineering has also picked up the concept of resilience. So everyone has their own concept, and this is the concept that we at the Rockefeller Foundation are using for definition of urban resilience. So it is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems. So considering the city as a system and as a system of systems, capacity to survive, adapt, and growth. So it's not only about surviving and coming back to what it was before, but it's about having the capacity to adapt, to learn, and to grow, no matter what kind of stresses and shocks. So having such a strong city and social fiber that you could be prepared for anything that comes your way. And this becomes increasingly important now that because of climate change, it's more difficult to predict with accuracy the coming flooding or winds or storms, or probabilistic risk is becoming a little bit less manageable in terms of studying and having a more sound probabilities and expected results. So this is I'm going to talk briefly about the case of Medellin, Colombia. So Medellin in 1988 was, I have some statistics here, so I wanted to share this, was basically the most dangerous city in the world. It was the most dangerous city in the world. No one really, could ever go to Colombia on vacation, much less Medellin. The city was overtaken by narcos. There was lots of drug cartels there. It wasn't, it was really no jobs there. People were leaving. It was really a dire scenario. And at some point, Medellin was supplying 80% of the world's cocaine. So just to, give you an indication of how bad this city was. There were lots of kidnappings, and then the average murder rate in Medellin was 17 people per day. So it was a city in crisis. But, something happened in Medellin, because this is Medellin today. Today, Medellin is a thriving city. They have won tons of awards about urban rehabilitation, and they got rid of their cartels. And, now poverty fell by like 25%. So it's really a thriving city. It's beautiful to go. It's safe. So what happens? So, everyone started to study what happened in Medellin and what did they do. And so, yes, they started a campaign against the drug cartels. They increased the police force. They tried many things, isolated, but nothing really seemed to work. And so what they did in the 90s is something that we now call resilience. So they were building their resilience without, that being something that was said. So this is the director of planning of Medellin saying, we finally decided to stop doing, one siloed approaches, and we realized that everything was interconnected. And so we took a more systemic approach. And so this is basically what the success of Medellin was. So without even knowing them and without saying them, they really were the beginnings of the concept of urban resilience. So what they did is they basically started campaigns in terms of, yes, drug cartels, fighting against the cartels, but also really connecting and facilitating the movement of people. So Medellin is a city with lots of hills, and it was difficult to go from one hill to the next one. So that was perfect, because then you will have one drug cartel in one hill and one drug cartel in the other hill, and it will be very difficult for either the police to get there or for them even to integrate. And so now you have lots of electric escalators in these hills, which really helped in terms of getting for those people that were up there that needed to go to the city for jobs, for going to schools, children, elderly, and they also have this very innovative gondola system that is connected to the metro that also allows the travel times to really decline. So we've talked to people there that the travel time before the systems was, say, like an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and a half to go up like some windy roads to the top of the hills and then walk, and now it's really reduced to like maybe 30, 35 minutes. And it's much more frequent. And they also really started looking at providing spaces for social cohesion, but not just building any park or any library, but like the best and the most pretty libraries and parks in Medellin are in the poorest communities. And this was, something that was done very much on purpose, with the expectation that the community will be so proud of it, that will take care of it, and will really appropriate the space. And that really worked, and that is something that, now other cities are starting to incorporate. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that also what happened is that like most of the money from the cartels like went to the city. It was like taken and invested like in the city. So yeah, at least from that point of view, it helped.
Yeah, but then you didn't see that happening in Cali, and you also had lots of cartels there, right? So, yeah. So, and you didn't see that happening in other cities in Colombia. So, yes, there's people that think that that was also something that really contributed, but even the way that it was spent by the government was what created the difference, right? It was the policy of, we're not gonna, build fancy high-rises for the rich, but this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna connect the poor, we're gonna connect the hillsides, and we're gonna build a metro, and we're gonna allow flow of people. Yeah. And I know Empresas Públicas of Medellin is a very strong institution, but they also have a very strong private sector in Medellin. So.
Was there like a huge change in like political structure at this time too?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a long period of time, so yeah. But Medellin, among the Colombian cities, and I work with Medellin and Cali, has a history of continuous policies. So they're not, unlike many other places in Latin America, they're not the city where, new government, new plan, we're gonna basically try to destroy everything that the previous mayor did, and we're going to start from scratch. No, they have a history of continuation, and that's something that the other Colombian cities recognize and aspire to. And Cali, I think it's at the earliest stages of this same process, having faced very similar circumstances. So this is what we call the resilience dividend. So investments in different sectors had impacts that were bigger than its parts separate. So investments in transportation have effects in much more than transportation only. And so these multi-benefits and taking into account this multi-benefit approach is what the foundation calls the resilience dividend, right? So that extra benefit you get from working in a systemic way, and taking into account all the benefits that you could get out of a project. So how do we try to capture that? How do we try to measure resilience? Or how can we say that something is more resilient than other things, right? It's a very elusive concept. It's not something that we can put numbers on. First, I spent some time previously doing this graph showing that resilience is basically the combination of inputs from many other fields. And so how do they contribute? For example, in terms of the engineering aspects, new technologies, new materials, new ways of constructing stuff that provides more robustness, new forms of study of climate change and new estimates, but also geography and economic development and what happens at the household levels and why mortgages are important. So there's many things that contribute to resilience, and I just wanted to map that, saying that we by no means consider that urban resilience is a field on its own. It just feeds from the things that all the other fields are working on. And so what the foundation, along with the consultancy firm Arup, did is they spent the good part of 10 years basically analyzing how could you measure and how could you determine resilience? And what they did is they did a series of deep case studies and deep visits to several places that were affected by different types of shocks. And they went back there and they tried to study and to ask and to analyze what are the things that allowed those cities to respond and what are the things that limited those cities to respond to those shocks. So they went to Concepcion in Chile after the earthquake. They went to Cali. They went to Medellin. They went to New Orleans. They went to Surat in India for flooding. They did like, I think it's 12 or 14 cities. They came up with thousands of factors that they defined and aggregated, and they came up with this resilience framework, which basically is a circle to indicate that everything is interconnected, but also defines 4 dimensions of resilience, or 4 pillars for resilience, and 12 drivers. So 12 factors that are important for resilience, and I'm going to go briefly through each of them. So the first quadrant is health and well-being, making sure that the people that are in the city have their basic services covered. So basic needs, livelihoods and employments, and cities that ensure public health services. So those are factors. If you are working in those factors and you're improving those factors and you are helping the city meet basic needs, then you are automatically improving the resilience of the city. Second one is how these cities are organized. What is the social structure of this? So promoting cohesive and engaged communities, social stability, security, and justice, and also economic prosperity. So those are also factors that contribute to the resilience of the city, and we're going to then see some examples of Medellin also in this one. And the other one is how, where are those, what is that population living? So the natural and the physical infrastructure in which these citizens are. So these natural and protective natural and human-made assets, this is transportation and provision of critical services. And the last one is how does this community and how do the citizens and how does the city manage knowledge? So how much, and this is going back to your point in terms of how is the leadership, how empowered are the citizens and the stakeholders, and how good the planning processes are. And this goes, I mean, there's more details. Each of the 12 drivers have sub-drivers, and each of the sub-drivers has variables. So you can go at a more detailed level of analysis that I think, if you're interested, we can share the papers. But so each of the drivers has sub-drivers, a total of 62, and then each one has variables or indicators of outcomes for a total of 156. So just in case you're interested. And what I also discover is there were things that really you could not put in any of these factors, and that you could not really fit. And so some people that work in urban resilience talk about 5 qualities of resilient systems, others talk about 8, others talk about 6, but they all really point to the same. It's qualities that if you can work on these qualities in any project or intervention that you're doing at the city level, you will be making the city more resilient. And this is reflective, so the capacity to learn. So like you were saying, learn from what was done in the past, do not reinvent, and just go from there. Being resourceful, so being able to easily repurpose and reuse the resources. And this is something that also has been used a lot in business administration. Being robust, this is very much an engineering, design characteristic, and redundant. So having extra capacity, having a backup plan. Flexible, has alternatives and strategies, and integrated, that works with other systems, that is connected, and inclusive, that it's really taking into account the interests and the well-being of all parts of all members of the city, and not just the minorities or the most powerful or the elite or the politicians. And Prior to this, I was talking to some colleagues about examples also from the US, which is not a region that I covered, but I think that this one was really interesting about how other cities like Medellin, but in this case it's New York, had completely different reactions for the same shock. So apparently in 1977 and in 2003, New York City had the exact same shock, which is basically blackout, complete blackout for more than a day. And what happened in 1977 and what happened in 2003 are, very, very different, and the situations of the city are very different, and we can see that in the resilience framework. So in 1977, there were riots, there were fires, there were people arrested, there was looting. The blackout really caused a lot of economic and social problems. And in 2003, it was a completely different story. I mean, it was very much New York coming together the way that many times has done before, to basically help each other and to power through and come back stronger. And actually, New York's resilience strategy, New York is one of our cities, and New York resilience strategy, basically the first page says, resilience, and as a definition of the dictionary, and it says resilience, it says see New Yorker. That was like what the mayor put there. So I thought it was very interesting, and part of it is like if we look at what would have been the qualification of the resilience framework for New York City in 1977, there was a lot of insecurity and a lot of crime in the city. There was a lot of lack of law enforcement. It was a city very much in decay. So all this, if we will put them as green, yellow, and red, this is how New York City would have been qualified in 1977. And actually, the resilience strategy of New York City right now, this is how they recognize themselves now. So part of that building resilience is what led to these very different outcomes. And if we go back to the example of Medellin, this is how Medellin qualified itself in 1988. And this is also in the resilience strategy. Medellin is also one of our cities. And this will be the Medellin today. I think they're still very critical of themselves, and they're pushing themselves really hard, but there's a huge improvement on how they're defining how resilient they are as a city. And I thought it was interesting to note that there is a relationship between the city resilience framework and the 7 qualities of resilience. So we're not saying that everything that you do has to have the 7 qualities of resilience, but this is a good indication of, for example, planning. You should expect planning to contribute to resilience, to be reflective, which means learning from past planning experiences, inclusive, which means that it really was the result of stakeholder engagement, that you did consultations with the city, that you took into account everyone's needs, and also integrated, which is that it really is taking into account all the other things that are going on in the city and all the other work that is happening there. So it's really only the infrastructure sector where you could achieve and see the 7 qualities of resilience in the work. I mean, the rest, it's not feasible to think that all things should be robust, inclusive, redundant, flexible, integrated, and reflective. And I come from the Inter-American Development Bank. That was my last job, and there I was working in a group that was called the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative. And so when I joined 100 Resilient Cities, one of my first questions was like, what is really exactly the difference of these two things? It wasn't really exactly clear to me. I'm an economist, and I was trying always to ask, like, but how do you measure it, and how is it evidence? And so after reading a little bit and having several discussions, I understand that. So sustainability is more focused in the efficient use of resources, taking into consideration the long term. And so the use of resources and the balance that you will have in using them in like a long-term horizon, and recognizing that resources are scarce, and so the availability of them is not unlimited. And resilience doesn't really take that into consideration. Resilience is looking at being able to be prepared and respond to shocks and stresses. So things that are more resilient but not very sustainable is, for example, diesel backup, right? Diesel backup is something that will be very resilient, because then that means that you have a plan B. If the electricity goes out, you have your generator, but it's not sustainable at all, because it's not desirable that everyone is burning diesel all the time. So there's things that are sustainable but not resilient. For example, in the same energy example, nuclear energy, because you're just really depending on that one plant. And so something happens there, you don't really have a backup. But it's very sustainable because it's clean, not a lot of use of resources. So these are some examples of the contrasts between resilience and sustainability. Ideally, these two concepts will work together, and you will work in improving both of them, but there are very much sometimes not in agreement. This is something we were discussing also in Puerto Rico, because we are working in a long-term plan, and part of the things that are coming out from the community engagement process is we should provide some sort of financing mechanisms for all households to have generators. And part of it is, yes, I understand there's people that don't have electricity 7 months after the storm, but that might not be the answer, because you don't want to be burning diesel, and we should be advocating in that case for like solar power, but then you have a lot of technology issues there. So what do we see the future of urban resilience to be, and what is the opportunity, and why this is, for me, very exciting now, and I think for many other organizations, because there are so many other people working on these. The European banks are working on these. There's so many new NGOs focusing on cities that I think it's really becoming a very exciting field. First, the information revolution, basically. 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years, and there's so much possibilities for the use of this data and how it can influence the way cities and systems work. I think that brings a great opportunity, and so is the fact that these cities, they're going to have to, most of the cities right now are at a point where they're going to have to renew their infrastructure that they built decades ago. So they've grown so fast that we have many cities right now thinking about major pieces of infrastructure. And so influencing those decisions and the way those designs are done, it's going to be fundamental. For example, I also work with the city of Quito. Quito is building their first metro line, $1.2 billion in investments. Ecuador. So it's the biggest infrastructure project in the country ever. This is going to completely revolutionize the city. And so we're really working with them, and they're also part with our network, to think about it as more than a transportation project. To really think about how to build those stations so that they can become shelters if needed. And if they're going to become shelters, it's not just about having space, but about having maybe water capture mechanisms, solar panels, capacity to plug in mobile kitchens. The design should be have protection for flooding, and just you're going to build it anyhow. Yes, it might be a little bit more costly, but the benefits in the long term are going to be huge. If you want to think about how this is going to change the land use, so how the prices of apartments and land around those metro stations are going to change, and so how you can establish land value capture mechanisms that will get some of that value back to the city to finance public spaces, to finance programs like City Bike, to make sure that the stations are accessible. And it has been a struggle because this is very much a already complex engineering project where the engineers don't want to be having to deal with 25 other issues. They want to build their metro, build it well, and so be it. So we're really, things like this are happening all over the world, in all over our cities. They're reaching the point where they really have to renovate, and so this brings a lot of opportunities. And as we were discussing for Puerto Rico again yesterday, we were at the Clinton Global Initiative conference in Miami, and we were basically making a plea to the private sector and the think tanks. So if you have technology for for resilient housing or for reusing materials, recycling materials for the construction of schools or the rebuild of much of Puerto Rico, like now is the time to bring them back. And also, just to focus on all these resilience strategies must focus on ways to include the vulnerable population. So there's this nice phrase that I really like. Any city, however small, is in fact two cities, the city of the poor and the city of the rich. And the idea is that we really have to work to make sure that those differences are very much or becoming less and less, because that's also one of the factors of resilience. And this is a photo from Sao Paulo, Brazil. You can see the striking differences of the quality of life. And that's the case in many Latin American cities. So briefly, just to tell you what we do to do this, we work with 100 cities. This is a project that was launched by the Rockefeller Foundation in the 100th anniversary of the foundation. So when they turned 100, they decided to work with 100 cities. And the goal was basically partner with cities around the world to help them become more resilient to all the social, economic, and physical challenges of the 21st century. So we selected 100 cities in 3 waves. It was a competition. It was a very tough competition, actually. It's only 100. So it was like 35 the first year, then 32, and some drop out. So we completed the 100 like a year and a half ago. And what we do with them is first, we help them hire a chief resilience officer. We believe that part of the systemic change of cities and pushing them to think about resilience is having someone there that actually works on that. Cities have financial officers, they have risk officers, and they should have resilience officers, because everyone has already too much on their plate to be thinking on this extra thing. So one of them is a chief resilience officer. Second is support them to develop a resilience strategy, in which they will go through the process of making a diagnosis of how is the city, how are the systems, what are the opportunities, what needs to be improved, and they will put together a resilience strategy that will become a guide or a blueprint for the city and where the investments need to be done. Not by the resilience officer, but by the other departments. The idea is that the resilience officer will just be the person that aggregates and communicates and makes sure that all those links are being established. We also provide a platform of services to support pilots, innovative ideas during the strategy process, but also in implementation. And I'll go briefly through each of these. And then also being part of the network, it's 100 cities. They really become close with each other. They exchange. They have their own land community. They exchange ideas. They invite each other for events, and they more like problem solve together and really call each other to help after any event. For example, a month ago, we had in Mexico City that had an earthquake some months ago. We had a network exchange, which means that we brought together six or seven of our resilience officers from cities that either had already gone through this and recovered, or that were also worried about this. So San Francisco was there, LA was there, Toyama in Japan was there, it was Mexico, so they were like really getting together and trying to problem solve around this issue. And I think that's something that they regard as one of the most interesting parts. I don't think they like to be pushed to do the resilience strategy so much. But these are our resilience officers. I don't think we have 100 yet because there's some changes. But they are like what we believe they're agents of change within the municipality. We have 45 resilience strategies. They each take around a year or a year and a half to make. We expect to have 20 more by the end of the year. So this is the year where many of the cities on the first and second round are completing their work. This is sort of the process in Oakland, one of our great cities. And this is the partners. So we work with public and private sector, and these are all companies or a subset of companies, because we have 90, that provide pro bono services to the cities to help them either pilot ideas, problem solve, or so in some sense, it's not only the NGOs that are working with cities, but majority of all these partners also have some sort of city level focused program, which is amazing to see, actually. This is what the sectors that those services are used the most. There's 49 corporations, 37 nonprofits, 7 academic institutions, and 5 governmental institutions. And what they mostly are asked to do are help in infrastructure, in the design of infrastructure. And second one here is the disaster risk management and urban planning, and technology. So it's all basically related to the third dimension of resilience. And this is just a sample of, this is the cities, these are all our cities. And when were they selected? So the first round of cities, most of them are done with their strategy and well into implementation. Second round of cities, most of them are finishing the resilience strategy, and the third round are really halfway. 21 cities in the US and Canada, 21 or 22. One of the regions that has the most. And so part of the interest of this work, especially for me, was the power of this aggregation of cities. So doing the exact same thing with 100 different cities gives you really the possibility of aggregate, of learn, of see the trends, aggregate the needs. Ultimately, what we want is really incorporate resilience in the market and in other fields. So if we know what 100 cities are telling us, and we can aggregate those needs and pass them either to civil society, the private sector, the public sector, academia, then they can start thinking about resilience and providing those solutions. So we'll create this marketplace for resilience building that will be brought back to not only our cities, but then all cities. And we have one example from these 4 cities got together, and these actually are pretty strong examples from the network. And they really became, demanded to have the same type of analysis that really is not something that is easily available, or that it was readily ready from our private partners. And actually, Earth Economics partnered with Impact Infrastructure, and basically they created a new program to provide a triple bottom line analysis, cost-benefit analysis for infrastructure. And so there's little things that cities need, and we're pushing them to the private sector to see if we can help make this resilience market more dynamic for cities. And that was all. So we can have time for questions.